They may not understand it, they may not believe it, but it's been here since the beginning of time. You can find trans and gender diverse people back at the time of Jesus. And if they took the attitude sometimes harped about in fundamentalist communities is accept everyone, love everyone, try to understand it, have some empathy. What happened to our sense of kindness and compassion that we had for other people? Stop listening to your fears. And this is really what it comes down to. Very small numbers, and it's all about fear.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. This episode is part of an ongoing series regarding trans rights. Today, our guest is Dr. Marci Bowers. Dr. Bowers is a pelvic and gynecologic surgeon with more than 32 years' experience. She is the president of WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Her gender-diverse work has been highlighted through appearances on The Oprah Winfrey Show, CBS Sunday Morning, Discovery Health, and the TLC reality series I Am Jazz. She was interviewed in 2021 by Leslie Stahl for 60 Minutes. Dr. Bowers is recognized as one of the 100 most influential LGBT people on the Guardian's World Pride Power list. She has performed more than 2,250 primary male-to-female vaginoplasties and 3,900 gender-affirming surgeries overall. The impulse for this trans rights series is 3 bills currently moving through the State House. One which bans trans girls from playing girls' sports, one which requires kids to get signed permission slips approving their preferred name and pronouns, and one which allows doctors to be sued up to 20 years after treating a trans youth. Alaska has many big problems: the pressing need to increase the funding of our public school system, and finding a solution for an imminent energy crisis among them. But instead of working on these very real, very substantial problems, we are spending the last weeks of session debating whether trans youth exist and have rights. They do exist. They do have rights. Dr. Marci Bowers, welcome to the podcast.
I'm really honored to be here. Thank you.
So before we get started, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
That's a long story, but I've been around a while. But I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, state of Wisconsin. I was a pretty typical kid. Doors were unlocked. I was actually assigned male, but very early on, I knew I was female. I felt inclined that way. Not that I didn't do certain stereotypically male behaviors, because you learn to play the game. But back in the 1960s, we didn't think gender transition was possible. I was very slight, and so I was a bully victim pretty extensively throughout my teen years, at least a couple of years when we changed schools. But that really inspired me. We always say it gets better, and that was the case. I got through it. I ended up going to college, going to medical school. I was my class president. I excelled, but I still felt very inclined to be more of a feminine person. I translated that. I went into obstetrics and gynecology thinking I could displace my feelings and play the rules of society, but I realized that was not enough. And so even after 3 children, and a spouse who remains with me today, I had to do the difficult journey of transitioning. And so I did that about age 35. Subsequently, I got into gender affirming surgery when I realized in the early 2000s that there were very few people in the landscape in the United States doing these procedures. I can imagine there was no surgeon in New York, no surgeon in San Francisco, Chicago, Philadelphia, Boston, unimaginable. And I did that because the gender community really had no one. And there had never been a woman doing these procedures, let alone someone with trans experience. So I moved to an unlikely town, Trinidad, Colorado, again, another small town in very southern Colorado. I worked with the father of transgender surgery, Dr. Stanley Biber, and I guess they'd say that's history. I'm now the WPATH president, which WPATH is a science-based medical organization that sets standards for the care of trans and gender diverse persons. And I'm the first president with trans feminine experience.
Thank you so much for that. Were you doing surgery prior to moving to Colorado?
Yes, I was an OB-GYN. So I was, of course, I was delivering babies, and I delivered more than 2,000 babies in my career. But I was also doing gynecologic surgery mainly, but There were individuals who were transmasculine who needed work like hysterectomy and that kind of thing. So that's where I began my work with the trans community.
It seems so recent. It seems so shocking that there was so little happening prior to the early 2000s. Can you talk just a little bit about what was available prior to 2000 as far as gender affirming care?
It was performed mainly in very unlikely locations around the globe. One of the most famous locations was in Casablanca, Morocco. There was a gentleman named George Barou who developed the prototype of the modern day vaginal surgery that we still use today. And he performed surgeries there. There were scattered locations in Europe. Americans will recall Christine Jorgensen, who in 1954, I believe it was quote unquote the first American to have gender affirming surgery. But it was really marginalized because being gender diverse or just transgender, then we used to call them transsexuals, that was something that was considered pathology, mental pathology, just like we thought of homosexuality as being mental pathology instead of diversity. And really, this is the hardest thing that society has taken so long to understand, which underpins a lot of the arguments against gender affirming care and acceptance of trans individuals, is that people don't realize that gender, just like genitalia, is messy. People think of genitals as being either or, but we are all male and female. Every single human being, every man has estrogen in his body. Every woman has testosterone. And at birth, 1 in 50 individuals have evidence of what's called intersex. So the simple opposition would say, you're born a man. You're born with a penis. That's it. Your gender identity should match. And it's as simple as that. But that is not true. In fact, at birth, there are babies born with penises that have 2 X chromosomes. There are babies born with female vulva and they have male chromosomes because they lack the receptors to respond to testosterone. And then everything in between. There are dozens of intersex conditions, and really the general population doesn't know about this. We've done a very good job of suppressing this because the medical community long ago decided that gender was binary, and so therefore we need to make the genitals binary. And so there were surgeries designed to put people in that neat little box of being either male or female. So it's not really surprising that where it comes to the idea of gender identity or how one feels in terms of male and femaleness, that people have a hard time understanding that.
Obviously, I know you're a surgeon. The folks who come to you would be coming to talk about potential surgery, it seems, most of the time. But does every trans woman desire surgery? And does every trans woman desire the same surgery? And I guess the same question for trans men. Can you speak a little bit about the diversity of
Sure.
what surgical options people would want or not want and what that looks like from your perspective?
Yeah, if ever there was a failing of the medical and surgical community in treating trans persons was not recognizing that there's diversity even amongst transgender persons. So in other words, it's never one size fits all. And we're seeing this now, which explains a lot of the rise in the numbers, is that people are saying, well, I'm really not, I'm not in this binary camp. It used to be if you're not male, then you have to be female. And if you're not female, then you have to be male. But we're realizing that there's a lot of space in between that area where people are now, this is especially true of this generation where people just want to be themselves. They recognize they may not be fully male, but they feel more masculine than they do feminine. And they are using medicine in the way they see if they fit, not how doctors see fit. And so they're demanding things that may be short of full transition. They may not even desire surgery. They just want to be recognized. They maybe just want hormones. They may just want pronouns. Mm-hmm. And I think to me, I'm a flag-waving supporter of diversity, and I think I see that as a good thing. I think that I see society finding a happier place.
Have you ever done a consultation with someone where you've come to the conclusion with that person that they don't desire surgery?
Oh, certainly. I've been at this a long time, 30 years in treating gender diverse people, and even my own thinking has evolved quite a bit. But absolutely, there are sometimes you come to the conclusion, somebody comes in and they're asking for, let's say, vaginoplasty, and you realize that maybe that isn't really what you're looking for. You're seeking it for reasons that don't completely make sense. So surgeons are at the end of the line in the sense of treatment for this, but all along the line there are checks and balances that go back to the person and say, look, this has to fit with your life. You're making decisions for you. We're here to give you information and empower you to make a wise and sensible decision for your life.
You mentioned before we got started that we're not doing gender affirming surgeries on minors. Can you talk a little bit about that policy, and has it always been that policy? Because something that we are hearing in the legislature is that these procedures do happen on minors, and that's why we need laws about them.
This gets down to the standards of care, which is an evidence-based, scientifically derived document that generated by our organization, WPATH, so-called standards of care. And this describes the orderly way in which gender-affirming care should be ideally delivered. And so when it comes to surgery, it's first of all not prescribed for adolescents. There are exceptions, and it's important that exceptions be allowed. But this is the real problem, is that we have non-medical people, politicians and lawyers trying to make these are very complicated decisions. And if you look at Ohio, recently, Mike DeWine vetoed that bill. Kansas, these are all Republican-controlled states. Governor Cox in Utah on the sports bill there. These are all governors that issued vetoes because they listened to their constituents. They listened to parents and families, and they realized that these are complex issues that should be left to parents and doctors and the individual themselves. Why are we as a society allowing politicians to make medical decisions?
One more question about hormones. My limited research, I learned about the Dutch protocol and how the Netherlands, Finland, Sweden, Norway, the UK have moved away from treating youth as liberally as they had in the past with puberty blockers and hormones, and that there is a little bit of tension between what's happening in terms of mainstream trans youth healthcare in America versus at least in those 5 countries in Europe. And I don't know if you can speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, no. And meanwhile, gender diversity is being taught now in Irish public schools. India has expanded access to people. Spain allows gender markers to be changed at age 16 without surgery or hormones. But they hear what's going on here, and they hear our conservative arguments, and they're also being overwhelmed. So particularly in the case of the UK, there was a lot of buzz about the Cass report and what it had to say. And
Can you tell us what that report was?
It was a retired pediatrician, not involved in transgender care, but basically they came out and said that the level of evidence for trans care in adolescents was low. And the reasons for that, of course, are because it would be unethical to get high-level evidence. And yet high-level evidence isn't available for cancer care, diabetes, or most of the other things we treat in medicine. But nonetheless, the real problem was that they had a centralized system. It was a clinic called Tavistock. All of the care was being funneled through there, and they were overwhelmed with 5-year waiting lists. So you have to look through the dust in that report, but to realize that really, and again, none of the trans care has been stopped in any of the countries you mentioned. It's still going on in all of Europe. But the difference is that now they have tightened that a bit because, first of all, they're overwhelmed. You can't have a 5-year waiting list. We know this group has suicidality. So they regionalized the care. So that's a positive. and they are doing compulsory research. Now, here in this country, we would think that's unethical to make somebody do research as part of their treatment, but nonetheless, they're going to get results, and the results are going to show what we already, those of us who care for these populations, know that gender affirming care improves the lives of the individuals it treats. And it's not even close. It's overwhelmingly helpful.
I want to talk about surgical regret because, again, that is an issue that is brought up by the conservative right. And particularly, we have one bill that's about being able to sue doctors if people regret the care that they received as a minor. And I guess in your experience, what does that look like to regret gender affirming care later in life? Because I know that if the numbers are large enough, of course, there's going to be a few people here and there that change their minds.
That's right. No matter what it is, all you need to do is look up celebrity breast augmentation that went bad, and it's nearly 10% of celebrities regret having breast implants. Knee surgery has a 20% regret rate. But in gender affirming care, no matter how difficult it is, it's consistently at or around 1%. Now, it has moved higher lately. And again, I think part of that was because we were too focused on the binary. I think there were surgeries done that didn't recognize that people are gender diverse and that there are non-binary genders that people would be more comfortable with. And I think if we were more, as a society, more accepting of that diversity, allowing someone to transition, not completely with surgery, maybe not completely with hormones, there would actually be less surgery and maybe even less hormone use. So hands off. It's just not a big issue. And especially if you can empower people to make good decisions, they're not going to regret. Now, I've been at this a long time. I passed the Guinness Book of World Records for my predecessor. I've been in this a long time. And I can think of only a couple of people very early on that regretted their surgical aspect. But even the treatment with hormones, it's not a commonly witnessed entity. There's isolated individuals of what we would call in medicine case reports of disappointment. Now, anytime someone makes a medical decision, especially if it's permanent, that's not good. We have a big responsibility as providers to get the best information and to empower our patients to make the best decisions.
What is the process that you use when you're meeting a potential patient for the first time? I assume that you don't meet a patient for the first time and decide that you're going and schedule a vaginoplasty for the next day. I assume that there's a process before somebody's approved for surgery.
Yeah, it's a lengthy process. There's a lot of time for someone to explore their feelings without surgery. And obviously, there's a period of time where there's some evaluation. Usually, mental health evaluation is included, only because there are coexisting mental health conditions that themselves need treatment. This group does have higher rates of depression and anxiety, and so that also deserves treatment, even though it can coexist with feelings of gender dysphoria. But by the time they've come to me, it's usually been several years. And frankly, a lot of accommodation. Most of the people we see that come in finally ready for surgery, I mostly do male trans feminine persons. They've been living as a woman in society, working, they have jobs, they have partners. I'm icing on the cake is all I am.
Are there any best practice rules? Like, at what point would you feel comfortable doing a surgical consultation? Like, do you have any set rules that they need to have been on hormones for a certain amount of time? They need to have lived as a woman for a certain amount of time?
Right. That was certainly true of the previous standards of care. But again, we also have to listen to people on the left and the actual trans community. Their feeling is that, hey, why should I have to jump through all these hoops for something that involves my body? This is my body. I should be able to make a decision and have that right. If anything, WPATH has been very slow to listen to that. And we've gotten our own criticism from the left. But we're deliberate. We're thoughtful. And we always try to be scientifically minded when we make these recommendations. I'm always about slowing down. Look, life is long. You want to make meaningful, thoughtful decisions. And I will say that gender transition it's hard on people around you. And this is where the mental health support is so useful, because if you've got kids, if you've got parents, if you've got friends, family, workers, changes like that, they're not as shocking as they used to be, but they take some adjustment.
I want to briefly just touch on a couple of the specific bills happening in the legislature. The first one that is getting the most traction, and frankly, that's the most divisive, is trans girls in girls' sports.
Yeah.
And the reason why I say it's divisive is because I am a Democrat. I know Democrats in this building who tell me that they support LGBTQ everything.
Yeah.
But they don't believe that trans girls should be playing girls' sports because it's not fair to the girls. And they say it just very matter-of-factly, like that they're making perfect common sense and that this is just going too far. How do you respond to that type of?
You have to listen, but what they see is they see a man competing with a girl. And let's back up. First of all, it's a very small percentage of the population. Actually, transgender youth participate in high school and college athletics at a rate that's substantially less than the general population. And Governor Cox, when he vetoed the athletic bill in Utah, it actually involved 4 girls out of 80,000 high school and college athletes. And he basically said, why are we spending so much time on such a, divisive issue? Secondly, there are already trans kids participating in college athletics, in high school athletics, and in lots and lots of red states around the country. And nobody's that upset. Nobody's upset about it. First of all, they don't know because they're seamless and they're girls. When they transition early, boys and girls physically have the same muscle masses until about age 8 or 9. And it's just testosterone where things begin to diverge. But there are a lot of girls that run testosterone levels that are higher than some of the elite male athletes. This was true when the IOC started trying to sort through this. And they still haven't been able to figure out on a real consensus about what to do. But probably there should be some sort of, the Leah Thomas example is cited, even though she didn't even win the race that they were all fighting about. But
for our listeners, Leah Thomas was a swimmer
at Pennsylvania.
Yes.
And she's big. And that's the point, is that she had a lot of time on testosterone. Mm-hmm. And so probably if you had some real adults who could get in the room, fair-minded people, and say, okay, what is it? What are the criteria, physically, mentally, hormonally, structurally? What are the real dividing points where we could make things fair? How could we make this fair for everyone? We don't want someone to have an unfair advantage, although naturally occurring unfair advantages happen all the time. Michael Phelps has a wingspan like a condor, but he doesn't get points taken off because his fingers are 6 inches too long.
And I think the reason why we're not going to have adults in a room talk about this in a civil way is because the folks promoting this bill have said that they don't really believe that trans girls exist. Mm-hmm. They've said that they're still very much entrenched with a previous century's way of thinking that this is a mental problem, that the parents are not getting the appropriate mental health care for these kids. And so if they don't believe that trans girls are real, if they don't believe that trans girls are entitled to the same constitutional rights and protections as other people, it's very difficult to have a conversation about fairness.
Title IX is going to come up and slap them in the face like it did in West Virginia. West Virginia's anti-trans bill is now been set aside. Yeah, because they lost. That was just last week. If you come down to fairness, it is about Title IX protects an individual to participate in sports, period, and regardless of sex, gender. So this is just targeting a minority group. They may not understand it. They may not believe it, but it's been here since the beginning of time. You can find trans and gender diverse people back at the time of Jesus. And if they took the attitude sometimes harped about in fundamentalist communities is accept everyone, love everyone, try to understand it, have some empathy. What happened to our sense of kindness and compassion that we had for other people? Stop listening to your fears. And this is really what it comes down to. Very small numbers, and it's all about fear.
The last bill that I'll just ask you to comment on is the permission slips for pronouns bill that our governor has brought forward. And this is where school districts are required to have a permission slip from a parent in order to call a child by a name other than the one listed on the roster, or to use different pronouns than based on the gender that the school has listed for the child. And
it's a tough one. It's a tough one because we want to respect the rights of parents to be involved in the lives of their children. And so we always encourage communication between parent and child. And it would be, in a perfect world, the child would tell parents. But in some cases, that would be a dangerous situation. Sometimes it's not safe at home. And other times, school does feel safe to kids and a place where they can experiment with this sort of thing. It's not that they're being recruited or drafted or peer influenced so much as it is school is a place where they spend a lot of their day and they're exploring. So again, it's about individual rights, I feel, still, and everyone doubts the ability of a child to make up their own mind about their gender identity. But it's been well established that they really can do that responsibly. I think that's generally a dangerous bill, although I don't feel as strongly about it as I do the others. I think it's a delicate issue, but I don't think it needs to be legislated.
Thank you so much for being on the show today. It was really an honor. Is there any last thing that you want listeners to know? Any other misconception that we haven't talked about that you think would be helpful for listeners to hear?
As you can see, if you look around the country, these bills are gradually being defeated. Florida all heard about the bills coming through, and they all went down to defeat. Iowa, all of the bills that were passed that were anti-trans went down. So there are states that have enacted anti-trans laws, and it's going to take a while to undo the damage that's done. But for parents that don't know or don't have a gender diverse child, or if they're newly confronted with one, just know that parents that support their transgender child, that child has a 40% less likelihood of suicidality. So that's very important. And no matter where you stand on this, no matter where they are, love your child. Don't be a statistic. Try to get help. Try to understand. The medical community is not here to recruit patients. We're here to help. We're here for support. And we do have information with science behind it.
Dr. Marci Bowers, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Oh, thanks. It was a real pleasure and an honor.
Thank you so much for listening. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@aklug.gov or call our office at 907-465-4940.